Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really, really well. Today is going to be episode 3 of Let's Edit. We haven't done a Let's Edit video in a really long time, but a lot of you guys said that you were interested in more episodes, and I'm happy to really make as many episodes as you guys would like, and as long as it continues to be helpful and you guys are learning from it, it's something that I enjoy, and I think it's a nice way to sort of demonstrate all the different topics that we've talked about and sort of bring everything together into one video. So because of that, I'm not going to go into excessive detail explaining the theoretical reasoning behind every single suggestion. I will try to give you my general reasoning behind the edits, but we'd be here for 3 hours or 4 hours if I explained like the real deep theory behind every single thing that I suggest. So if you are confused about any of my suggestions, I have covered most of the types of edits that I'm going to make. I've covered in my videos on sentences and my videos on paragraphs, so I will link to those in the description. So a huge thank you to our volunteer today and my Patreon supporter, Carrie Noel. She's going to let us take a look at the first chapter of her YA novel, and I really appreciate her doing this. So please keep in mind that editing is subjective. We don't all like exactly the same things. I will, like I said, walk you through my reasoning, but you may not agree. Feel free to disagree with my edits in the comments. That's absolutely fine, but please keep things constructive when it comes to criticizing the author. We want people to like making these videos, and to continue to make them, I have to have volunteers. So please be kind and keep criticism constructive when it comes to the writing and to the author. So thank you guys so much for cooperating with that. And let's go ahead and jump into Carrie Noel's YA novel. Chapter 1. I punched his gut and the 12-year-old tumbled onto a pile of roadkill Oreo ice cream. So normally with the opening line, we want to really pull the reader into the story and really get people invested. And to me, this opening line is just a little bit confusing. At first, I thought that the roadkill Oreo was like some kind of ice cream flavor that I just didn't know about. I'm not really an ice cream person, but then later on, I realized that you meant that her little brother's ice cream had been thrown into the road. But by the time I figured that out, I had already forgotten about this first sentence. So I think you could pick something that has just a little bit more pop. Not every first sentence has to be really exciting and really stunning and a really strong hook, but I think this one's just a little bit too confusing. So I would reword for clarity. Hey, his friend yelled. His tone was that which is uniquely reserved for females from males, which said, "What the heck, you're crazy." This wording is awkward. It almost seems like you're trying to have a sense of humor with the narration, but as the story moves on, I don't see anything similar to this style of humor anywhere else, so I would reword this to something more natural. I gave the kid another good kick on the ground right where I'd punched him before. Maybe my memory is a little bit too short, but personally, I didn't remember where the narrator had punched him, so right where I'd punched him before wasn't clear to me. He curled up, trying to cover up the tears. I assume that you mean that the kid is embarrassed for crying. I think if he's just been kicked in the stomach, it's more likely he'd be very focused on the pain of that, maybe unable to breathe. If his breathing is okay, he's probably going to be scrambling to his feet or trying to protect his vital organs, his face or his stomach. Probably he wouldn't yet be concerned with dignity, so I would probably put more focus on his pain or panic, at least at first. Behind me, my little brother Stuart watched stone-faced, wire earpiece of his glasses crooked, blood and tears smeared across his face. Snot ran down to his lip. Since the narrator can't see behind herself, describing what's behind her reads awkwardly and is jarring, especially because this is first-person narration, so we really don't have any wiggle room to show what the narrator can't see. Jerk, the second boy sprinted at me. You know big words for a little boy. I do want to note here that some of the cursing has been edited out for this video, just in case anyone wanted to use this in a classroom or for anything like that. So if the wording doesn't seem strong enough for how upset everyone is, that's why it's been edited to be a little bit softer. I sidestepped him, grabbing his jacket and spinning him into the asphalt with his momentum. From the apartment next to us, we were sure to get some stares. I didn't care. I'm having a little bit of a hard time visualizing exactly where this is taking place. I assume it's maybe in the streets outside of an apartment building or maybe in a parking lot near an apartment building. I think you could be a little bit clearer about exactly where this is taking place. I'm also wondering if you could raise a little bit more tension by describing specifically that people are looking or are watching. Maybe there are people outside of the apartment sort of milling around and they do turn and look to see what's going on. My main reasoning behind that is if there's no one outside or no one specifically looking, kids tend to make a lot of noise, especially teenagers. They tend to sort of yell and carry on. I know outside of my house, I hear kids sort of carrying on and fighting and goofing around and screaming and stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily go and look or intervene unless it sounded really, really, really severe. So I think that it might help to raise tension if instead of supposing that maybe somebody could have heard or maybe somebody might want to get involved, if you could describe somebody actually watching or maybe people actually turning to look to see what's going on. Additionally, I would expand on why she doesn't care. What is she thinking and feeling? More introspection would be nice here. You next, I asked the third boy who trembled, freckled face pale with panic and indecisiveness. What does he appear indecisive about? I think you could show this a bit. Are his eyes darting towards the street like he's thinking of running? What is bringing her to the conclusion that he's feeling indecisive? I just think you could show us a little bit more of where she's getting that from. He was bigger than Stuart, older by at least 3 years, but to me, when I was about to go into my sophomore year of high school, they were all just kids, easy targets to give a piece of their own medicine. This should be taste of their own medicine rather than piece of their own medicine. However, I'd probably cut this anyway just because it's a cliche and it feels a tad old or a tad dated for a 15-year-old protagonist. I'm glad that you're getting the ages in at this point because I was starting to sort of wonder what age I should be imagining. I think it might be helpful to get the ages in a little bit sooner and to be a little bit clearer. I'm not sure if her little brother is 14, if he's 10, if he's 8. I think it's just a little bit unclear. The other thing that I would recommend is that you give a little bit more context to what's going on. So you have this opportunity to really show the fight, to show what occurred. And if it were me, I think I would back up a little bit and show more of the fight before the sister intervened. That would give you a lot more room to sort of depict the context and the subtext and what the characters are feeling, both the brother, the sister, the bullies, or the other kids. It would help a lot if we got a better sense of whether this was justified in any way, whether it was totally an unprovoked fight. And I think, especially early on, we really want to pack in a lot of information. And in the early chapters, the writing should be fairly dense, not dense like a whole lot of information crammed in, but very dense in its functionality. It should be serving a lot of functions. We should be getting a lot of information as quickly as possible and as entertainingly as possible to sort of get us up to speed on what's going on. Another option would be to raise intrigue, so to not really explain what the fight is about, to not really give those details, but to get the reader interested and excited to learn the details. So to do that, you would have to sort of raise questions about what's going on, which would require giving just enough information and just enough context that the reader is really wondering, I wonder why they said that, or I wonder why they did that. And I'm really not getting that here. I both feel that I don't have enough context to be invested emotionally in what's going on, and I don't see anything that's raising intrigue. I don't have any questions. I'm not waiting to have some question answered or waiting to read on to find out what's going on in this fight. So I think that's the biggest weakness that I see so far in just sort of what you've chosen to start with and how you're presenting that information. I would also consider that as far as we know, the sister gets involved here sort of unprovoked. So as you continue to read, you sort of get the idea that this is because her brother was being picked on, and it may even be that this was a good thing, that she was doing something noble or something kind by getting involved and trying to protect her brother, even if maybe she was overly violent about it. But as far as readers can tell at this point, it sort of seems like she just sort of comes unhinged on some kids, and we don't really get enough context to understand why or to get any sense of her reasoning behind the actions or whether it was justified or not. So that's something I would consider because you want the reader to really connect with this character, and I'm not really getting why she's doing what she's doing. His gaze shifted behind me and his expression changed. I think this is just a tad hard to understand and could be reworded to something like his gaze shifted to something behind me just to eliminate any confusion. I realized too late what that expression was. Hope, relief. I turned around. The fist hit me like a brick to the face and I fell onto the asphalt. I think you could add details here to make this more visceral. Does she skin her elbows? Does she whack her tailbone? Just a little bit more details about what the actual experience is of falling on the asphalt. Don't touch my brother, a girl my age stood over me. I felt sick. My heart throbbed in my face and ears. I struggled to recover my breath. I'm not sure if this is a physical or emotional reaction, so I would clarify. And I saw red. It seared my vision. I screamed, ran, body slammed the girl onto the ground, and punched her in the jaw. She groped at me. She was bigger, yes, but I was quicker. I was grittier. I could pummel her without thinking and without remorse, and I did. At first, the narrator feels sick, and then that turns into anger. I think you could be clearer about what transition occurs. Is she afraid and then becomes angry? Is she concerned and then the anger takes over? It's not entirely clear. I think you could give a lot more introspection. I think introspection would help a lot with giving more context, which, like I mentioned, this just feels that it's somewhat lacking in context enough to really connect with this character. There are a lot of questions that I have about who she is, and I think some of that is okay. It's okay to not know everything about a character right from the get-go, but some of it has me a little bit confused. For example, is she an excessively violent person? Is she overly violent? Or does this seem and feel justified to her? And if so, how and why does it feel justified? It just seems like a very extreme reaction, especially because she does mention being a sophomore, so she would be, I guess, about 15. Is there a reason that she doesn't end the violence as quickly as possible? Why doesn't she grab her brother and walk away or run away right now? Why does she keep engaging in this violence? Why does she kick the boy once he's still on the ground? Why doesn't she just let it go at that point? Why doesn't she verbally engage with anyone? Why doesn't she try to negotiate or just tell people to stop, especially if she's bigger and older than most of these kids? So I have a lot of questions about the logic behind her reaction and the reasoning behind her reactions, and I think that a lot of that could be brought across with more introspection. Stop! A woman's shrill voice cut across the parking lot. I jerked my head up, eyes wide and alert, as the girl sobbed beneath me. We don't need a full play-by-play of the violence, but I think some additional explanation of what happened would be helpful. It feels like we jump forward a bit without a lot of context. This woman was the same well-built stature of the girl beneath me, same big freckled face, frazzled dry hair, ashy white complexion, probably her mom, but more importantly, an adult. Adults didn't play fair. They wouldn't bring a knife to a gunfight. They'd orchestrate the gunfight, and then they'd call the police and get you sent to juvie. This wording comes across like she thinks adults set up fights between kids to get them sent to juvie, but that didn't happen here, so the meaning or the relevance is just a little unclear. My brother didn't need that. My mom didn't need that. I knew better. I don't think I knew better has a clear meaning or really feels needed here. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my brother, and sprinted down the road. The woman screamed after us, and we disappeared into the residential area. She can't see herself disappear, so this description feels a little, just a little bit external. I know it might seem like I'm being overly nitpicky here, but this encourages the reader to imagine her disappearing, which pulls the reader away from her, when normally with YA and with first person, we want to keep the reader in her shoes. We ran through front yards and backyards and past dogs pounding against fences until we got far enough away that I could comfortably position us behind an old beige Buick. I'm going to be a little picky again here with the wording far enough away that I could comfortably position us means that she had to get far away to get comfortable, as if stopping behind a car earlier would be physically uncomfortable. I completely understand what you mean, but I think a clearer wording would be something like until we got far enough away that I felt comfortable positioning us. I was out of breath, a rush of adrenaline making me shake, sweat dripping down my face. It was just slightly chilly today in a wet, cold way. Start of summer break, but bleary. I couldn't sit still. I turned to my brother. He sat beside me, also breathless, but stiffer than I was, closed off from me. I took his arm. Let me see your face, I said. I'm not really feeling a strong sense of tension here. I'm not really worried about what's going to happen. And a big part of that is because you haven't really established the stakes yet. So you mentioned that, she might get in trouble, she might go to juvie, but it's very unlikely that she's going to go to juvie given this, this fight between kids. And those stakes are also a little bit floppy or a little bit weak. I like to call it floppy stakes, but what I'm really talking about is to it's helpful to define the stakes to crisp them up. So ideally, we want to know that if X thing happens, Y thing will happen. So if this occurs, this bad outcome will occur. And it needs to feel more definitive. It needs to feel less wishy-washy, less questionable, because we don't really think she's going to go to juvie. She might get caught. She might get in trouble. They might have consequences, but it's all very maybe. There's a lot of up in the air. So something, for example, that might help to firm up the stakes would be, let's say the character wants to get a scholarship to an art program, let's say, and the only way that she will be able to go to this art program is if she sort of, keeps herself in good standing with the school, that she doesn't get in trouble, that if she gets anything on her record, that it will make it impossible for her to get the scholarship. So maybe there's a stipulation, if she has any disciplinary action, she won't be eligible for the scholarship. Well, that adds a lot of stakes when it comes to getting caught. All of a sudden now there is a very clear consequence to her getting in trouble, or her getting caught, or her in any way having this fight be made public or made known by other people. So that would be an example, just a random example of how you can make firm stakes. And firm stakes, they go so far towards increasing tension, because we really, as readers, want to connect to what there is to lose. And when it's very wishy-washy or unclear, we can have a very hard time caring all that much about what the outcome is. I also think you could think a lot more about how her personality and her perspective impacts her voice. So with first person point of view in particular, we want to really sort of dig down into who this character is. That's also really important in YA. We want a really strong connection to this teenager. And I feel that the word choices are quite generic. It's not really clear what personality she's bringing to the narration, what vibe she's bringing. It's not even really clear what time period this is taking place in, or her educational status, her income level. Like, we're just not getting a lot of information in the narration about who she is. And it's really nice if the character's life and their perspective and their personality can really color the language used. That helps to make the narration more engaging, and it helps us to get a better idea of who this character is. So I would really like to see less generic writing, less generic word choices and phrases, and things that feel very specific to this individual. Things like residential area and comfortably positioned just don't sound that natural in first-person narration. There's also a lack of tone being created by these descriptions. Position lacks any connotation or any sort of energy behind it. Think about the energy created by alternatives like ducked behind a Buick or threw ourselves against the door of a Buick. Even the weather, which is slightly chilly, is described in a very flat way that doesn't create a sense of a positive or negative connotation. She's sweating, so does the slightly chilly air feel good? Really think about how this character specifically experiences the world and try to inject more energy and emotion into the word choices. This would go a long way towards improving the writing. Stuart didn't move toward me. He set his jaw, head still ducked, like little boys do when they don't want you to see them crying. So I took his face and pulled it to look my way. He resisted. I pulled harder on what he set solid. The phrasing "what he set solid" sounds very unnatural and not at all like a teenager, so I would reword that. I'm not sure if forcing Stuart to look at her is meant to make her look caring or kind or concerned, but no sensitivity or tenderness is coming across in the way that this is described. She comes across as quite forceful and callous, and it's hard to make a positive connection with this character because we're not really getting a glimpse of what makes her someone we would want to root for. This might be a good place to put a soft moment to make her more likable, so we see a little bit more of an ooey gooey underbelly to her so that we don't feel like she's quite so hard. "Don't look at me," Stuart screamed. I set my jaw, frustration flaring up. "I just want to see it, Stuart. Leave me alone." I paused, watching him. He wasn't moving, wasn't budging. He needed time. I sighed and rested my head against the door of somebody else's car. My face throbbed where the girl had hit me. The 3 houses crammed together in front of us, another car parked in the single-lane driveway of the one I watched. This sentence feels awkwardly worded. First person doesn't have to sound exactly like natural speech, but this just feels a little bit too far from natural speaking to me. Despite the dilapidated appearance of its neighbor, the one before me was neatly manicured, tulips like buttons decorating the front of it, vibrant and stark against black fertilizer. Dark green grass, a cleaned sidewalk, a lush tree shaded us in their front yard with heavy leaves that likely blossomed in the spring and blazed in the fall. I'm going to be a little nitpicky again and say that the one before me reads awkwardly after also saying three houses crammed together in front of us. I can infer you mean the one in the middle, but I just say the house in the middle so that this feels more natural. Their windows were clean and free of cracks, curtains open. A cloth flag rippled lazily with the wind, reminded me of something you'd get from the dollar store, had a faded Bible verse on the front. In the window, a little white Shih Tzu poked up its head. It barked, nearly voiceless through the glass. We couldn't sit here forever, but I didn't feel like getting up, and I definitely wasn't going to go back to our apartment. Not yet. We'd run into those people again. So we've talked before about descriptions and how they can sometimes just feel like random lists of information because it's not really clear what vibe is meant to be brought across by the description. And I do have a whole video on descriptions, which I think you would potentially find to be very helpful. But with this description of this house, it's just not really clear why it's significant. So this house seems to be nicer than the houses around it. Is that comforting to her? Is it annoying to her? Does she think that the Bible verse is really charming or comforting, or does she think it's offensive, or does she think it's silly? It's just not clear what her perspective is, and you could add so much more to it. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to have her go into all this detail of explanation of what she thinks about every individual detail, but more just try to create an overall tone, such as having her use words that are charged in a certain way. So more positively charged or more negatively charged. Maybe, she could think that the dog is a stupid Shih Tzu. That would let us know that she's not into this sort of frou-frou dog. Or maybe she thinks that a Shih Tzu is sort of a waste of space dog because they don't guard your house. So there are lots of angles and perspectives that she could take on what she's describing, but it's described in a way that feels just a bit flat, and it doesn't really let the reader know what's significant about this. Why is she describing this house? Why does it matter? What does it say about her? And those things can really make a huge difference and make the writing a lot more engaging. I glanced back at my brother. I knew he wasn't going to talk about what happened, like he hadn't wanted to talk about anything that had happened with him lately. Teachers were making comments about him being moody or disruptive. There was talk about getting him in aid, getting him tested. His teacher recommended a counselor. He dealt with fights more often. He attracted bullies for being small, emotional, temperamental, awkward, poor. Kids took advantage of that, but they had always been his own age. You're telling us a lot of information here, but I think this would have a much greater impact if shown to the reader. You've already started the story with a bullying scene, and like I said, I would rewind that a little bit and show more of the bullying scene, especially maybe before she gets, or shortly before she gets involved. You have the ability then to show what is the brother doing that's attracting bullies. Is it justified in any way? Is it totally unjustified? You mentioned that he's awkward, that he acts, maybe he acts a little bit odd or a little bit strange. You have so much opportunity to show that if you show the actual fight and what he says and does and how that attracts that attention and how that results in bullying. And that would really go a long way towards bringing across his personality and also justifying her involvement and explaining more why she gets involved. I think you just have such a great opportunity already to bring this information across through showing that there is no reason to rely here on telling, and the telling just doesn't have quite the same impact. I also think you could use dialogue to bring across the trouble that he's having in school. So for example, maybe he talks to her about it. Maybe she overhears his teacher talking about it. Maybe her mom talks about it, or she hears her mom talk on the phone about it. I think there are ways that you could bring this across in dialogue so that you don't have to, again, rely so much on telling. I didn't feel guilty about snapping on those kids, but I knew it could spell trouble for us. I was skirting the line of acceptable behavior. This phrasing seems a little bit unnatural for a teenager to me. I'd gotten suspended in the past, stressed out my mom, let my temper get the best of me, or simply chose to not put up with the crap that half-educated school staff put middle school girls through. I'm not really sure what you're implying here exactly with the half-educated school staff. I would clarify this, it's just not clear what you're implying. In high school, I'd been doing better. Remarkably, we'd stayed in Providence for a year and a half without moving, and I was just starting to feel adjusted. Prior to living here, we'd moved everywhere from the Midwest to New England, Cleveland to Boston, moving about once a year as long as I could remember. This was one of the longest times we'd lived in one place, and I wasn't sure why. Normally, we'd stay somewhere longer because my mom met a guy, but she hadn't met a guy yet here. The previous paragraph sort of implies that they've stayed longer because the narrator has been doing better in high school. Then she says she doesn't know why they've stayed this long. Then she says it's because her mom hasn't met a guy yet. I would try to narrow down to one explanation here. If they always move because her mom met a guy, then her behavior doesn't really tie into why they've moved. So that means she needs a different reason, some other stake, something at risk because of bad behavior that she's worried about, some sort of consequence that she's trying to avoid. She actually seemed well adjusted, like maybe, just maybe, things had changed. She'd changed, if I could dare to hope for that. I liked living here. My school was all right, and as bad as things were for him here, Stuart wouldn't handle the stress of another move well. I needed to not rock the boat, and I hadn't until today. I'm not sure that Stuart not handling the stress of another move really works all that well for stakes. It feels a little bit like you're trying to force the stakes when really they're not exactly there. If Stuart is struggling so much, then it seems like moving would be better. It doesn't seem like staying here really is any benefit to him if he's really struggling. I think that maybe you really need to step back and think about the stakes and what you want the stakes to be, and that would probably help a lot with all these little bits of emotions and bits of explanations of the stakes, which I think are just, they're not really all adding up in a way that gives a really clear picture. And like I said, the stakes don't really feel precise, but it also feels a little bit unclear. So she doesn't want to move, but also there's not really any reason for her to stay. I don't really see why she would be particularly concerned for moving. I don't know why Stuart being stressed about a move would be better than him being stressed by being beat up by kids. I just don't think the stakes are really solid or really coming across. So that's something I would definitely work on. Keep in mind too, you don't have to explain all of the stakes or the whole circumstance right here. You can sort of imply it. So you could say, maybe she could say something like, this is the most settled that I've ever felt and I really don't want to move again. And you could build a little bit of tension that way. And then later on, maybe in a more appropriate context, you could sort of play off of another conversation or something that's going on. So maybe she talks to her mom about not wanting to move. And then you could, in that conversation, provide a little bit more detail and a little bit more nuance to what's going on. So I'm not saying you have to give the full picture and the full explanation. It's just more so what's coming across is that you as the author don't know what the stakes really are, or you're waffling a little bit on the stakes, and it just doesn't give that sense of sort of confidence in your writing and your authority with this story, because the reader wants you to be the authority on this story, and I'm getting the impression that you don't really know what the stakes are, or you're struggling to bring them across. We can't tell Mom about this, I finally said. He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. I knew he heard me, and I knew he wouldn't tell her, for the same reason he barely told me anything anymore. I got the impression she didn't know why he didn't tell her things anymore. I would consider clarifying this. It will only stress her out. This stays between us, all right? I don't think there's any need for this additional dialogue if she's certain he already understands. Stuart still didn't acknowledge me. Come on, I finally stood, pulling Stuart to his feet and wiping off the sidewalk grime from his butt while the Shih Tzu in the window went nuts barking. I took Stuart back toward our apartment, beginning the slower walk home down crackling sidewalks, knowing by the time we got home, those people would probably be gone, and we could hopefully slip in before my mom got home from work, wipe off the remnants of the fight, and pretend like nothing happened. Watch the repetition of home, I would reword to avoid that. If Stuart is bleeding, it seems unlikely they'd be able to totally hide that the fight happened. I think you want to give the impression that this is something that they've done before, that they've hidden fights before from their mom. Maybe they're quite secretive. I get the impression from their mom. If that's the case, you'd think that they would have a little bit better idea how to hide it. So maybe, she might try to put makeup on it, or they might try to make a cover story about how he was playing sports and he got injured. If this is something they've done a lot, you would expect them to be better at hiding it than thinking they'll just wipe off the blood and mom won't notice, because the injury would still be there. So I'm just not getting the impression this is something that they've dealt with a lot, and I think you want to give that impression. I took the stairs because I knew my mom wouldn't. I assume you mean her mom would take the elevator, but I'd probably just say that directly, though if she is trying to beat her mom home, it seems like taking the elevator would be faster, and you can't really run into someone in an elevator if you're both getting on at the same floor, unless you both get there at exactly the same time. I may be being picky here, or maybe what I'm saying doesn't make sense, but if mom was in the elevator, they wouldn't be able to run into her because the doors would be closed. They would have to get there at exactly the same moment. I held Stuart by the arm. I think he would have crumpled against the wall of the stairwell and stayed there if I had let go. He went with me without agency into the hallway that smelled of ground beef, and I steered him to our apartment door and stuck my key in the lock. I assume that Stuart is sort of catatonic here, and while that can work, in these early scenes, it's a really good opportunity to get the reader really invested in these characters, help them to really understand who these characters are. And it almost feels like you've written Stuart out of the scene. He's there, but he's not really there. So he's not contributing anything. We're not getting any sense of his personality. And I think on the whole, that's probably a detriment and not an asset. I don't think having him be unresponsive and catatonic is the best choice, because you're really missing out on an opportunity for us to make a connection with this character. It turned seamlessly, fluidly, catching on nothing. The door was unlocked. My stomach dropped. My mom was home, and Stuart's face was still a mess. This could be a really strong, oh crap kind of moment, but because we don't really have a strong sense of why mom knowing about the fight or upsetting mom would really definitely create a consequence, it seems very wishy-washy if this would result in any sort of move or any sort of problem. Because of that, it just doesn't have the impact or the oomph that it could have if the stakes were more defined. And I think that's unfortunate, because I do think this could be a sort of a strong anxiety-inducing moment. I bit my lip, then pulled Stuart down the hallway into the laundry room. This was a little confusing. At first, I thought she got into the laundry room inside her own apartment, but then I realized she went to a communal laundry room. I would clarify that she doesn't go through the door after she unlocks it, just because it's very slightly confusing. Inside was a big sink used for I don't know what. We certainly didn't ever take advantage of it. I dug into someone's clothes in the dryer and used their kitchen rag to wipe off my brother's blood and tears and sweat and snot. I put the wire of his glasses back into place and fixed his shirt. All the while, he gave me a dull look. I chucked the rag into the sink and steered him to our apartment. You sort of set up that oh crap moment with mom being home and then immediately fix it. And I think that's kind of a shame. You had this opportunity to do something intense or to have a very strong reaction from the characters, and you kind of walk that back by having them fix it before they see mom. I would probably take out one or the other. I would probably just have them have time to clean up before mom gets home, or have mom catch them. I think doing both, having them go to clean up and sort of try to avoid getting caught, it just doesn't really matter then that mom is home, is what I'm saying. So it's not impossible to do this. I'm not saying you absolutely can't do this. I just think you're sort of extending the sequence without necessarily adding any increase in intensity. Additionally, the writing just feels very emotionally flat, so there's no sense of tension or urgency to cleaning him up. Inside the apartment, the warm beef cooking smell wafted out of it, and Stuart ran into his bedroom. The wording is confusing because she's inside the apartment and the smell is wafting out. I would reword this. My mom was still in her waitress uniform, having just gotten started on dinner. I think you could cut having just gotten started on dinner. It's not a big deal. I just think that that's clear enough without saying. Her hair, dyed red, was tied up in a bun. She stirred the pot with a bit of energy, glanced behind herself, and almost smiled. Almost. Something shifted her expression. It turned shocked. Addie. Yes? Your face. I know, I said, though I didn't know, but I could make a pretty good guess from the throbbing and its location. That girl must have done some damage before I beat the crap out of her. I'm not sure if she just didn't realize that she was hurt. It seems that her face would be really sore, so it seems that she would know that she's injured. So I'm a little bit confused why she didn't attempt to address her own wounds, why she didn't try to hide the fact that she had been in a fight, if she wanted to avoid upsetting mom. And I get the impression she doesn't want mom to know about fights in general, not just only fights involving her brother. So I think this is a little bit confusing. And again, I think you want to give the impression that they've continued to have this problem, that this is something that they've hidden before, but then you include things that make it seem as if they've never done this before and they've never hidden a fight before. So I think that is a weakness in terms of consistency between what I think you're trying to bring across and the impression that the characters are giving. My mom pursed bright red lips which contrasted against her pale, chalky complexion, different from mine, though similar to my brother's. My brother was my half-brother, technically. I'd known many of my mom's boyfriends over the years, but two I never did, Stuart's dad and my own. Bright red lips falls into that generic description category that we've talked about before, descriptions that are just so common that it becomes almost invisible to the reader, sort of like big brown dog. You describe her as chalky and pale as well, and the other woman and her daughter from earlier you described as ashy white. The two so close together feels a little bit too similar to me. This also doesn't evoke a clear image to me, so I don't know if chalky is meant to be dry or if you mean chalky just as in very white. Both seem to lean slightly negative, like maybe they don't moisturize, but I'm not quite sure if that's how you mean it to come across. And it's important that the readers really do understand the vibe that you're trying to bring across with your description. So to me, the connotation is just a little bit unclear here. My mom didn't like to talk about my dad or Stuart's dad or even her own family. We were out on our own island here. Once at a sleepover, some girls claimed that it was possible my mom wasn't even my mom at all, and that's why she wouldn't talk about it. I guessed it was because of my dark hair, how much paler my mom was than me, and the way we were shaped so much different. My mom petite and curved, myself tall and lanky and wide-shouldered. Then they took turns trying to guess the ethnicity of the guy who knocked my mom up at 18. Half convinced he was just a dark-haired white guy, half convinced he was Latino, and a single obnoxious girl insisted over and over I must be indigenous. I didn't go to another sleepover after that. I don't think that this is the best placement for that information. I think ideally we would want this to be a fairly tense fight, a fairly quick-paced moment between her and her mom. I also think this gives just a little bit of a vibe like you're afraid to have the character describe herself, so you're trying to find a way to avoid having her give her own description. And that's totally valid. I completely get that. It's very awkward when the action stops so that a character can describe their own appearance. But I think this is almost more distracting because it feels too disjointed from what's going on. If this anecdote is important, so this is an important aspect of her personality or an opportunity to bring across an important aspect of her personality, I would make that clearer. So why was this a big deal to her? Why did it upset her so much? I think that could say a lot about who she is. If it does, if it doesn't say a lot about who she is, I would probably cut this because I think it's slightly distracting from what I think should be a more intense conversation with her mom. I doubted I inherited anything from my mom. She could have had the same hair color that I did, but I would have never known. It was straight, thick, and dried out from the amount she'd been dyeing it for as long as I could remember. Red exclusively, but the sort of darker red that's too red to be real and contrasts against her complexion to enhance how synthetic it looks. Again, I don't know what the connotation is here. Overall, I get the impression from the various descriptions of her mother here and the descriptions earlier about her mother's relationships with men that the narrator really does not respect her mother at all and maybe even looks down on her, which is fine. I just want to make sure that's what you intend. It's really important that the intent and the connotations are clear. Regardless, my mom was beautiful. Big round doe eyes, a perfectly symmetrical face. She worried over wrinkles that were past what was normal for a woman just barely past 30. The wording here is really awkward, so I would reword that. And she was always complaining about weight gain and diet. She was always tired, face pallid and eyes shadowed. She was beautiful, weighed down by those who couldn't see how much she was worth, and she could have done better than she had. I'd always thought so. I heard about the fight, my mom said. I think you mean that her mom could have done better romantically, but you might mean that her mom could have done better with her employers, or she could have gotten better jobs. I would clarify that a little bit. Just what exactly does she think her mom deserves better in regards to? And I think that would say a lot about her feelings towards her mom and would be a bit clearer. I just don't think this is entirely clear. I think her realizing that mom knows about the fight would have more intensity and more pop and more pizzazz if she thought she had gotten away with it for a period of time. But since she basically walks in and her mom more or less immediately says she knows about the fight, it just doesn't really have a pop to it. It doesn't really raise intensity. Again, I think just getting caught would be stronger than having her go to the laundry room, try to clean Stuart up, come in, and then immediately get caught anyway. I just don't know that this has as much pop or pizzazz as you could put into the scene. I think you could make this a lot stronger. I leaned against the dining table chair we had in our kitchen space. This seems unnecessarily wordy to me. I would cut this phrasing down, since it seemed she wanted to talk about it, but I wasn't planning on staying long. Considering the effort and the concern that she put into sort of worrying about mom finding out and worrying about what the repercussions of that will be, she really doesn't seem that concerned at this point. She seems to not really be worried at all about what happens, and I think that feels a little bit odd. You really used mom finding out as the stakes, but then when mom does find out, it's sort of like she doesn't even really care. She doesn't even expect the conversation to take a long time, and I think that feels a little bit awkward. They were jerks, I said. My mom returned to stirring the pot, and I thought that was my cue that I could leave, that I was getting off easy, so I got off the chair and started back to my room. Again, this feels very emotionally flat. She just doesn't seem relieved or concerned about her mom's reaction. That was my boss, my mom said. Who? The children you got in a fight with. Their mom was my boss. I swallowed and grabbed my arms, set my jaw. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I said. Shoot, she muttered as canned tomatoes spilled over the edge of the stove, draining into the crack between the counter and the stove where all the unmentionables lay. She grabbed a kitchen rag, nimbly avoiding allowing it to touch the stove's gas flame while she picked up red clumps, then threw the rag in the sink. Again, there are phrases that I just don't see a 15-year-old using, especially unmentionables lay and nimbly. I leaned against our little square dinner table and waited for her to try to teach me to be responsible, reasonable, not cause fights or anger random kids' parents, but she didn't say anything. This conversation feels very low energy to me. You alluded to all these complicated family dynamics, that she has all these issues with her mom, that that her mom has these relationships with men and they move a lot, and that she seems frustrated about that and doesn't like that. It also seems that she tends to get in trouble and that her brothers had problems, but there's no real subtext to the conversation. It just feels very simple and direct. No one seems particularly upset. She doesn't seem concerned about consequences. Her mom doesn't really seem concerned about consequences. It just feels like a very simple and not intense conversation based on all of these things that you've set up and all of these family dynamics, that it would be really nice if those things sort of shone through here, if we could sort of see those things impacting what's happening and impacting the things that they say and how they say it and how they interact with each other. I picked at the peeling edge of the table as my mom poured in canned tomatoes. Shells of garlic littered the countertop. My mom never cooked with fresh garlic. She'd throw in tomato sauce, a bit of ground beef, an immense amount of spaghetti, and call it a day, freezing most of it for the month's supply, and the rest would go in the fridge for the week. So this wording has me imagining all of these ingredients thrown into the same pot. Maybe that is what you mean, but I assume she doesn't put the pasta into the sauce. Sorry if this makes sense to other people, and for me, I'm just not understanding it, but I've only ever made pasta like in a separate pot and then put the two on top of each other when serving it, and this to me comes across like she's mixing them together and then freezing them together. I don't know, maybe you can do that. It just, to me, it sounds slightly odd. Garlic, seasoning, onion powder, salt, and pepper, those were the staples in our house, but here, wafting from the sizzling pan, came the marvelous scent of fresh garlic. I would think she would have smelled the fresh garlic stronger, or at least at about the same time as smelling the beef earlier in the scene. Assuming, based on how it's written, it sounds like the mom would have already been cooking the garlic before she got in. It was tantalizing, but it was wrong. It was out of place, didn't belong. But what really set me off was when my mom opened up the fridge, and out from its sticky white shelves came a slat of green. Slat doesn't really seem like the right word here. I would probably change this to package or something. Maybe this is regional, but I've never heard this referred to as a slat. What the heck, I blurted out. My mom stiffened and looked over, alarmed, but I didn't soften my voice. I think you could rely on showing here rather than alarmed, something like whipped around. I'm noticing a tendency to tell the emotions, which is okay sometimes, but try to show it when you can. Is that fresh basil? In a typical household, nice meals meant celebration for something like a promotion. A kid got straight A's. The Patriots won a football game. I would reword this because if you were writing something like a promotion, it would sound more natural to write a kid getting straight A's, not got straight A's. You could also drop the for something like entirely and write nice meals meant celebration, mom or dad got a promotion, a kid got straight A's, and so on. But my mom never stayed in one place long enough to get promoted. Stuart and I weren't anywhere close to straight A's, and the only time we ever watched football was when my mom was dating a guy who did, which right now she wasn't, thank God. In our house, nice meals meant one of two things. One, mom was moving and she made a nice dinner to celebrate the fresh start it would mean for us. Two, mom had a new boyfriend, which was usually the precursor to us moving after their inevitable breakup. So really, nice meals meant we were moving. I'm not sure if in a typical household using fresh herbs would mean celebration or making spaghetti from scratch would mean celebration. I think this is going to depend a lot on the household. It seems to me more that paying for fresh herbs might be the thing that meant it was a celebration, but I feel that this isn't that universal. I don't know that this is celebration food necessarily for a lot of people or by general standards. Obviously it is to her, and I would potentially just focus on, to her, this is odd because her mom only cooks like this when there's some specific thing going on, her mom has a new boyfriend or something interesting happened. But I think saying that in a typical household using fresh herbs or making spaghetti from scratch means it's a celebration. I just don't know that that generally will ring true to people, but you guys can let me know in the comments what you guys think. I don't know if that feels like something that's universal or universally understood. She glanced behind herself, little dimples at the edge of her red lipstick, and red hot warmth flooded my cheeks, adrenaline pumping. I took a breath, ready to blow. The structure of the sentence makes it seem as if her cheeks flood with warmth because Mom looks at her with dimples at the edge of her lips. If that's not your intention, I would put the girl's reaction before her mom's. If it is Mom's expression that upsets her, I would clarify that by giving some introspection as to why. I would also get rid of the repetition of red. This was it. This was the last straw. After everything, after how badly Stuart was adjusting, after the fights and the tears and his erratic moods and behaviors, she knew he deserved better. We deserved better. I think you need to walk the reader through her thoughts here a little bit more. So I'm not exactly sure in what way they deserve better, if they are getting into trouble everywhere they go, what makes her feel that they deserve more. I'm not saying that they don't. I'm just saying what's her reasoning? Why does she think that they deserve more? I also just don't think it's clear why she cares if they move or not. It may be that if you want the threat of the move, especially if they do eventually end up moving, you might do better to show how happy they are in this new place instead of showing it as bad. Because when you show it as bad and then give an opportunity to leave, it's a lot harder for that opportunity to leave to come across as stakes. It doesn't really seem like a problem to leave if they're getting beat up and they don't like being here. So that's something that I would consider. I know I've been harping on the stakes a lot more than anything else, but I think that's the thing that really just isn't totally making sense to me. She started. I have something to share. She didn't get to finish. I shoved the chair against the table. It jostled loudly against the hardwood floor, nearly toppling. She jumped and faced me, fully shocked. Don't even say it. I slammed the door shut to my and Stuart's room. I would describe her walking away before slamming the door to make this easier to visualize, and abandoned her to stand in the kitchen, crestfallen, holding the ladle loosely over a simmering pot of fresh garlic basil left whole on the counter. You describe what Mom looks like after the narrator has already left the room, which feels off and jarring since she can't see it. Okay, so let's quickly go over the key points. Use word choices that reflect Addie's personality, opinions, and age. Most of the descriptions feel as if they're basic or emotionally flat, so they don't really give a sense of voice, unique sense of place, or add dynamic meaning to what's occurring. Also, keep an eye on outdated phrases or phrases that seem too mature for a teen. It might help to read 10 or so modern YA novels to get a better sense of what you're aiming for. It might also be that you just need more time to develop this character and to really understand her inside and out before she can be a really strong narrator with a really clear voice. Use more introspection to bring across her thoughts, feelings, and reasoning. This would help pull the reader into the story, and it would help the reader to create a stronger connection with her and to better understand her actions and reactions. Clarify and strengthen the stakes. I've already gone over this pretty deeply. Just make sure that if the stakes are having to move away, make sure that it's clear why that's a problem, why she doesn't want to move. And you may find that you need to use something different for the stakes. Clarify or hint at Addie's goal. You could hold off a bit on explaining her bigger story level goal if you want to, but the threat of losing her goal, even if just a scene level goal, would potentially act as strong stakes for the scene, which might give you more to focus on and more emotion to add to the scene. It would likely also help give us a point of connection with her, something to root for her to achieve. Explain Addie's violence. The reasoning behind her violence doesn't necessarily have to be logical or reasonable. You can focus more on the feeling. What does the desire to lash out feel like to her? I assume this is built into her belief in some way, the belief that her character arc will be about. And you might want to give a little hint of that belief to add more context and more meaning to the aggression, the violence, etc. Normally, we don't necessarily need to know the belief this early, but because her actions are potentially off-putting here, it might be a good idea to give us a way to sympathize with her need or her desire to lash out or to hit back or attack back at the kids that she ends up in a fight with. Give Addie a moment or two where she is likable or sympathetic. I don't mean to say that she is unlikable. I more just feel neutral about her, but I think it would be helpful to give the reader something positive about her to connect with. That could even be her desire to protect her brother, which is understandable, but she doesn't feel affectionate or loving towards him in any particular way, so it's hard to connect with her. It's possible also this just isn't the ideal opening scene. So maybe you need to find an opening scene that gives you sufficient opportunities to demonstrate who she is, what drives her, what she wants, and to paint her problems in a light that makes her appear more sympathetic. It's possible that this just isn't the ideal opening scene for that. It's also possible that you just need to bring it across more clearly. A huge thanks to Carrie Noel for letting us look at the first chapter of her YA novel. This was very helpful. This illustrated a lot of really common problems with first drafts, with early drafts, with unpublished novels. I'm really grateful that she let us take a look at this, and I hope that you guys really learned something. These are problems that I see pretty pervasively in, like I said, first drafts, early drafts, or just unpublished fiction in general. If you guys want to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. Like I said, I'll also put some links in the description for videos that might be helpful if you maybe didn't understand all of my recommendations, or if you wanted more information on the types of edits that I recommended here. I will not talk to you guys again until 2025, so happy holidays to everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful new year, and happy writing.